Biden urged to secure release of American Muslim lawyer held in UAE. Record share of U.S. consumers blame inflation for eroding living standards. Muslim woman is key NASA scientist behind James Webb's telescope. COVID-19 cases continue to rise in the Americas, many at risk of long COVID. Over 1,000 die as record-breaking heat wildfires scorch Europe. From Toronto studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Saamiyah Syed. Our top story tonight. Dubai arrested Asim Ghafoor, the lawyer of slain Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, just 2 days before Biden met with the Emirati president in Saudi Arabia. Ghafoor, a U.S. citizen, was taken into custody Thursday at Dubai International Airport while en route to Turkey to attend a family wedding. Democracy in the Arab World Now, or DAWN, of which Ghafoor is a board member, called his arrest an unjustified detention. Ghafoor previously represented Khashoggi and now represents his fiancée, Hatice Cengiz. He is currently advising Cengiz in her litigation against bin Salman for Khashoggi's killing. DAWN leaders are concerned for Ghafoor's health and physical security given the well-documented record of abuse in the UAE. This includes torture and inhuman treatment, said Sarah Leah Woodson, DAWN executive director. In related news, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly told U.S. President Joe Biden that the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi is regrettable. But bin Salman also said U.S. hands are not clean, as other journalists are killed with impunity. The two leaders met in Jeddah on Friday. The CIA, along with other American intelligence agencies, concluded Khashoggi's gruesome 2018 murder was likely ordered by bin Salman. But at Friday's meeting, the Saudi prince pointed to American abuses. That includes the 2004 torture scandal at the Abu Ghraib U.S. military prison in Iraq. As well, bin Salman brought up the May 11th killing of Palestinian-American Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh by Israeli forces. The Saudi ruler said the CIA made mistakes, as it did when it falsely claimed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction in 2003. This became the pretext for the U.S.-led invasion of the country that year, which resulted in the death of over 200,000 Iraqi civilians.
This street is in front of the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C., United States, now named the Jamal Khashoggi Way. Jamal Khashoggi was murdered when he made his way inside the Saudi embassy in Istanbul, Turkey, on 2nd October 2018. Jamal was a Washington Post journalist and a Saudi dissident. 3 organizations worked on it for 2 years to name that street as such. Everyone who will enter the Saudi embassy will have a chance to remember Jamal Khashoggi. A similar campaign is now planned for Israel. They want everyone entering the Israeli embassy or passing by it to remember the name of Shireen Abu Akleh. Shireen Abu Akleh was a Palestinian journalist working for Al Jazeera. She was recently murdered by Israeli military on May the 11th, 2022. These organizations are campaigning to get Shireen Abu Akleh's name on the street where Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. is located. That is not going to be easy. Here is the founder of Code Pink, Medea Benjamin, sharing her next plan. She is an American author and a political activist.
This is precisely our next campaign. It's going to be a very tough one. It's going to be hard to get our city council to go along with that, but it's going to be a good fight in which we show the public support that exists here in Washington, D.C. for Shireen and for the rights of Palestinians.
This is Saleha Farouk from Toronto Studios for Muslim Network TV.
One of the 3 men convicted in the 1965 assassination of Malcolm X is seeking $40 million in compensatory damages from the city of New York. That's after he was found innocent last year of involvement in the killing of the civil rights leader who was also known as Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. Muhammad Aziz was arrested on February 26, 1965 for killing al-Shabazz, who was murdered on February 21st that year in Harlem, New York. Then 26-year-old Aziz was convicted in 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. Aziz and one of his co-defendants, Khalil Islam, were exonerated last November after a 2-year investigation. Aziz and Islam were members of the Nation of Islam and were found to have been at their homes the day al-Shabazz was killed. Islam's name was cleared after his death in 2009. The share of U.S. consumers blaming inflation for eroding living standards hit an all-time high, according to the University of Michigan survey released Friday. Nearly 1 in 2 Americans, or 49%, blame record-high inflation for their deteriorating level of comfort, according to the survey. This mirrors the all-time high reached during the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. That time, it was due to a global financial crisis sparked by the bursting of the U.S. housing bubble. Consumer inflation increased to an annual 9.1% in June, hovering around its 40-year high. U.S. consumer sentiment recovered in July, according to preliminary survey results. The U.S. Secret Service deleted text messages from January 5th and 6th, 2021. This was shortly after Oversight officials requested the agency's electronic communications, The Intercept reports. That has prompted questions and concerns about what evidence might have been destroyed about last year's deadly assault on the U.S. Capitol. The Secret Service says the messages were erased as part of a device replacement program. The Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General wrote to the leaders of the House and Senate Homeland Security committees about the deleted messages. The messages were requested as part of an evaluation of the January 6th riot believed to have been instigated by former President Donald Trump. A 100-year-old former Episcopal church in Wantagh, New York, has been turned into an Islamic center. The center held an inauguration ceremony Sunday to celebrate its opening. In 2019, the building was granted historic landmark status. The Islamic Center of Nassau purchased it and the 1-acre property at the end of 2021. Built in 1904, it is the second oldest surviving African-American religious structure in Nassau County. Islamic Center officials said they restored the building's interior to begin religious services. Leaders said they have kept all of the religious items that were in the church and offered to donate them to the town or a museum. A 20,000 square foot building will be constructed in the back of the old church to accommodate 300 families attending services there. Dr. Hashima Hassan's inspirational moment came as she watched in awe as the Russian Sputnik satellite passed through the clear morning sky in Hazratganj, India in 1957. More than half a century later, Hassan is one of NASA's leading scientists. She has helped develop the device relaying the first quality images of billions of years of the universe. The James Webb Space Telescope is being used to focus on the first light in the assembly of galaxies in the early universe. It aims to capture the birth of stars and protoplanetary systems as well as planets. Images captured with the telescope were released at a live event by NASA on July 12th. From those, scientists will be able to make discoveries about the life cycles of stars, galaxies, and planets and understand the ever-expanding universe. A story on COVID-19 cases that continue to rise in the Americas comes with details after the break, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Assalamu alaikum! Open up your eyes.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Beaker from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever-popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah. Let's explore.
To stop this genocide, we need your help.
Welcome back. COVID-19 cases continue to rise in the Americas, with new infections increasing by 13.9% from last week, the Pan American Health Organization says. Director Carissa Etienne called for countries to prepare their health systems to address the long-term impact of post-COVID conditions, also known as long COVID. An estimated 10 to 20% of people who have had COVID-19 may experience symptoms including persistent and severe fatigue, shortness of breath, and mental health issues. The Americas reports more than 161 million COVID-19 cases over the past 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of people in the region could be affected by long COVID. People with pre-existing conditions are particularly at risk. It is also greater for people who smoke and vape or have not been vaccinated. President Xi Jinping has asked officials to step up efforts upholding the principle that Islam in China must be Chinese in orientation. Religions practiced in the country must adapt to the kind of society pursued by the ruling Communist Party of China. Jinping visited East Turkestan, or what the Chinese government calls Xinjiang. This is the region where Chinese security forces have curtailed protests by Uyghur Muslims over settlements established by Han Chinese from outside the province. It is also where human rights watchdogs have uncovered evidence of mass detention, torture, rape, and forced sterilization of Uyghurs. During his 4-day tour, Jinping stressed fostering a strong sense of community for the Chinese nation, promoting exchanges, interactions, and integration among different ethnic groups, Chinese media reports. He underscored the need to improve the governance capacity of religious affairs and realize the healthy development of religions. In a piece published by The Guardian earlier this month, Julie Pazzetti and Kalina Bonchova wrote that 8.5 million tweets were directed at journalist Rana Ayyub in 27 months. They singled her out as one of the most brutally targeted journalists in the world. It also exposed Twitter's failure to address online violence. Ayyub, an independent journalist and Washington Post columnist, is a critic of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. She has used her social media clout to highlight the plight of Indian Muslims and the arrests of journalists in India. She has been accused of money laundering and tax fraud related to her crowdfunding campaign to help those affected by COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Ayyub has denied any wrongdoing, calling the allegations baseless. Rohingya Muslims from Burma are facing unforeseen delays in getting justice for genocide and other gross human rights violations. The process has prolonged the plight of the displaced community living in squalid makeshift tents in Bangladesh, analysts say. Master Abdur Rahim, an elderly Rohingya living in Kutupalong camp in Bangladesh, said it's almost 5 years since the most inhuman military campaign against us was perpetrated in 2017. Rahim spoke to Anadolu Agency on the eve of the World Day for International Justice, observed on July 17th. A school teacher, Rahim, fled the brutal military crackdown in Burma's western Rakhine state to Bangladesh along with his 5 children in August 2017. Despite documentation about the genocide against Rohingya Muslims in Buddhist-majority Burma, the international community has been accused of failing to secure justice for the persecuted people. Record-breaking heat has killed more than 1,000 people in Western Europe over the past week, particularly in Spain. Firefighters tried to contain blazes scorching swaths of 3 countries amid a worsening climate emergency, officials said this weekend. El País reports heat killed 360 people in Spain between July 10th and 15th. There have been heat-related deaths of more than 800 people last month, according to the Spanish government's Carlos III Health Institute. Madrid Barajas International Airport recorded an all-time high temperature of 108 degrees Fahrenheit Thursday. Some Spanish municipalities registered highs of 110 to 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Coming up after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back. It's time for our in-depth analysis segment. Let's watch.
Today, we'll be discussing an issue that I think every single American is aware of, and that is the issue of inflation, this drastic rise we've seen in the prices of goods across the economy. What is the current state of inflation in the United States? Why did this happen? What, if anything, can be done about it? Let's discuss that today with our special guest, Pia Malaney, who is the co-founder and director of the Center for Innovation, Growth, and Society, and a senior economist at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Pia, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Very well, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Very happy to have you. So let's start with just a little basic information for our guests. What is the state of inflation in the United States right now, and what led to this problem?
As most of us have probably been feeling in our pocketbooks, inflation is now at a 40-year high. And there's a huge amount of concern. We're hearing the Fed talk about how they want to raise interest rates in order to deal with this. We're talking about concerns about a wage price spiral and how we need to rein in the economy. So to answer your question, let's look a little bit as to why we might actually be in this position. We had low interest rates for decades, and then we got hit by the pandemic a couple of years ago. And in the face of what could have been one of the worst recessions we've ever seen, the government decided to start easing money supply and start pumping money into the economy by essentially giving people tax breaks and sending out child credits and just giving people money so that while they were forced to stay at home during the pandemic, they'd actually be able to keep the economy going, be able to feed their families and pay their rent and just keep going. But as a result, there was a fair amount of money pumped into the economy. And the second piece of this is that people wanted to stay home, obviously, because you don't want to go into an environment where you're likely to get sick, especially given that the US workforce is not really offering most of its workers universal health care. We're not offering paid sick leave to a lot of our workers. Childcare is a huge issue. So women needed to stay home to look after their children. So we had a lot of workers leave the workforce. We also had a huge pressure on our supply chains. Because one of the things we saw was that since we couldn't go out and eat at restaurants, we didn't want to travel, we weren't using services as much, no one wants to be in a gym or getting a massage during a pandemic. So the demand for services dropped significantly, and many of us shifted that demand over to goods. We were working at home, we needed new laptops, we wanted to redo our home since we were spending more time. We wanted our own cars since public transportation was suddenly much more threatening to use. So people started spending a lot of money on actual goods, and that increased demand for goods. And we had a lot of issues with our supply chains because they couldn't keep up in the face of COVID with the increased demand that we were seeing. So inflation really arises when you see a discrepancy between aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And we saw supply affected and demand affected. And so we ended up in the situation we're in now, especially as people started going back to work and we start seeing more money flowing to people as workers start getting their incomes back.
So that's a fascinating turn of events. So, essentially during the pandemic, the government provided financial support to people to keep them afloat. At the same time, supply chains were impacted by the spread of the virus. And then you had an increase in this demand because people had more money. It seems like a perfect storm. What, if anything, are policymakers doing about this? What can be done about this? Or do we just have to ride it out?
Oh, no, I think there's definitely things that we can do about it. Now, here's the issue. Policymakers are looking at different pieces of this. If you want to address the aggregate demand piece of it, then you can do what the Fed wants to do now, which is to raise interest rates. And what that will do is it will place downward pressure on aggregate demand. What it essentially will do is create higher unemployment and push the economy into a recession by pressuring aggregate demand down. And that will have an effect on inflation, but that will be after a long lag period, and it will come at a significant cost. It's also not very effective. If you manage to raise interest rates by 1%, you may, over a long period of time, maybe 5 quarters, bring down aggregate demand bring down inflation by about 0.5 percentage point, and that's going to come at a cost. So INET just put out a paper by an economist, Sarvaz Storm, where he looks at the empirical the history of how we did with controlling interest rates in the past and trying to control inflation through the use of interest rates. And he finds that it's very costly in terms of unemployment and recession and what it actually does to people who can afford it the least. So that's one path that we can go. And that's what we're hearing a lot about from the Fed currently. The other thing we can do is we can look at the supply side, which I think is where much of our inflation is really being driven by. So the supply chain issues that I talked about before, we need to look at what is causing problems with our supply chain. One of the issues is that people have not really gone back to work in the same numbers as they were working before the pandemic. So we have a lot of vacancies, and the Fed is concerned that wages are too high. Now, let me just point out that if we look at the contribution of wage increases to inflation, it's only been about 8% of the inflation we're seeing. If you want to push wages down, you're going to end up having workers bear the brunt of the solution. And the effect is going to be significant in terms of, once again, the pocketbooks of people, and we're going to pay for it on the backs of workers. If instead we start looking at what we can do to get workers back into the workforce, we should be thinking about how we can give them healthcare, how we can do something about childcare so that women can go back to work. How do we make sure that if they're sick, they have paid sick leave? All the things that workers need to actually support them so that they have a desire to go back into the workforce. And that's a better way for us to deal with the wage pressures than what we're currently seeing, which is the desire of the Fed to actually just bring wages down. And Jerome Powell has been very clear about the fact that the approach that they're taking is really to try and bring wages down. So I believe that we need to be thinking more broadly about how we can address some of the supply side issues in the face of the supply side shocks that are really driving much of this inflation.
So Pia, that is concerning to hear, because it sounds like what you're describing is that the way the Fed is going right now, they might eventually bring down inflation, but there's a good chance they're going to cause a recession while doing it and cause harm to your average worker out there. So your recommendation would be to focus more on the supply side of things. Let me ask you this. What do you expect to happen if the Fed continues along this route? And given that they have this independence that allows them to really not really answer anyone, what do you think the next year is going to look like? Do you think inflation is going to naturally level out? Or do you think things are going to continue to get worse, prices will continue to rise?
I think it depends on how certain things play out. So to the extent that the Fed pushes interest rate rises, I think we are going to see worse inflation. We're going to see a recession. I think left to its own devices, if we could actually just control the pandemic, I think we'd go a long ways towards getting people back into the workforce. If we can provide some of the longer term support that I talked about, we can help people get back to work. And I think that would be a way of bringing down inflation. Now, I should say that there's another factor at play here, which is that corporations, seeing these high inflation rates, have realized that because there is so much more monopoly power today than there ever was before, that they can raise prices to not only cover the cost of rising wages and to cover the cost of rising inputs, but over and above that so that they can increase their profits. So if you remember when I said that wages were contributing, the rise in wages was contributing about 8% of the current inflation, the rise in corporate profits has contributed more than 50% to the inflation that we're seeing today. And we have earnings reports from major corporations where they talk about the fact that inflation is good for them because they can increase their profits, because they can raise prices over and above what they need to. So we're seeing corporate profits at a higher than they've been in the last 20 years, maybe. We're seeing, for example, in the area of shipping, profits of 150 billion, that's up from 25 billion just 2 years ago. One of the reasons for this is that we have 3 shipping alliances that control 80% of our shipping lines. So because they have such a strong monopoly, they can raise prices and there's no one stopping them. So now we're in the situation of asking the government, can we do anything about this? And we're actually starting to see some efforts on the part of the Democrats to try and control this. So we have some bills that are coming up in front of Congress to look at price gouging. And we have Bernie Sanders putting forward a bill to actually try and institute a one-time profit tax, a very high tax on the profits from the last 2 years, over and above a certain amount, up to a 95% tax, which we've done before in the face of, wars and other shocks to try and control price gouging on the part of major corporations. So we have some tools within our control to try and control this.
And I guess the question is, will we use them, or are average people going to have to suffer a lot more in the coming months and potentially longer? We will see, God willing. P, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and your expertise. We look forward to having you back sometime in the near future to see where things are and if things are moving in the right direction. We hope so, God willing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's all from our Toronto studios tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Now you can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.